Hello everybody, it's Hater. Welcome back to another Destiny 2 build video. And yet again, here we are with another Grandmaster Nightfall build. Last time we talked about builds for both the Titan and the Warlock for Glassway, which now just means we need to finish it off for the Hunter. And what we're gonna do is talk about two different builds that will help you carry your Glassway Nightfall. One build's going to be your standard Void Hunter that lets you create heavy ammo, constant invisibility, orbs of power, and volatile rounds. The other build is going to be a little bit more fun, where we use Stasis to constantly throw grenades to freeze and CC enemies. At the same time, increase the damage of our volatile round weapons. So if you guys are into that kind of thing, then consider giving the video a like. Comment down in the comment section if you cleared Glassway after watching this video, and subscribe to the channel, hitting the bell to be notified whenever a new build video comes out. It really helps. Before we even get into the builds themselves, we need to talk about a few things when it comes to this Nightfall. First thing to note is there is an acute void burn, meaning we deal 25% more void damage. At the same time, the enemies are gonna deal 50% more to us. What we're gonna do with that kind of thing is build our loadout around void damage. We're gonna be using volatile rounds and void weapons to deal both damage and deal with the champions. For Glassway specifically, when it comes to champions, we're dealing with two different kinds: Overload Captains and Anti-Barrier Servitors leading up to the final room, then Overload Minotaurs and Anti-Barrier Hobgoblins while we're in the final room. So with that in mind, let's go into my inventory and talk about a few weapons or different loadouts you could bring into this GM to make your life 1,000 times easier. I'll be talking about some of the key exotics I use, the weapons I use, and some budget weapons you guys could replace these with. Starting things off, let's talk about the loadout that I ran in the background footage you see now. I like to use the Arbalist in my kinetic slot here because, well, it's Arbalist. Even though coming Tuesday it's going to get nerfed, it's going to lose 25% damage to champions, it's still going to be really good in GM content. Its perk is going to allow you to break every shield typing in the entire game and one-shot champion anti-barrier shields. This is also going to be a really solid feeling weapon to bring into this GM, because especially leading up to the final room, you're going to be dealing with a lot of wire rifles from the Vandals, and then when you are in the final room, you can use the anti-barrier rounds from it intrinsically to pass through the really annoying Hydra shields. Over in my energy slot, this is going to be one of my main void weapons. Now, something I will preface is that not many people in the entire game is going to have this weapon. I personally like using a Gnawing Hunger in my secondary slot, but this is no ordinary Gnawing Hunger because it is the curated Gnawing Hunger. You were only able to get this during Reckoning before everything got sunsetted and removed from the game. Any kind of Gnawing Hunger that you guys have with something like Tap the Trigger Kill Clip will work just fine. This is just one of my personal favorites to use when pairing with volatile rounds. If you guys don't have something like a Gnawing Hunger lying around from the Whirlpool, you could also use the Funnel Web, which will do the exact same thing at a much more limited range. But moving on over to the heavy slot now, this is actually one of the more budget weapons you could bring into your loadout. It is the Red Herring that you can craft after you beat the Witch Queen campaign. One of the things that we're gonna need going into this GM is a Void Power weapon. Now, there are not many Void rocket launchers out there right now that are really easy to obtain, but the Red Herring is, for one, craftable, void, and it can roll lasting impression field prep. It pretty much answers all of those needs without having to farm straight up strikes for 30 hours in hopes of a royal entry. All you would have to do is get the blueprint, craft it over at the Enclave, and then level it up so you have field prep and lasting impression. I really like using this a lot when we're going into this GM specifically, because volatile rounds paired with it basically gives it chain reaction, but for free when you pick up a Void Well. For another loadout we can talk about here, because I still do have a bunch of weapons in my inventory that are all relevant to this topic, we can talk about using Divinity in this GM. Now, Divinity, if you don't know, is probably the best thing in the entire game you can bring to this GM. We're dealing with Overload Minotaurs with really hard to proc Overload rounds, Wyverns that don't open up their crit spots when you shoot them enough, and bosses that take a lot of damage to burn down. All three of these things that I've mentioned are in the final room and all deal void damage. So what's gonna happen is somebody on your fire team is gonna be bringing this gun. It creates a crit spot for free that gives everyone 30% more damage towards the enemy affected by it, and it intrinsically overloads champions, answering all three problems in the final room. So for an example loadout that you could use, we're gonna swap off of Arbalest and put on probably one of the best budget weapons in the entire game, the Curated Night Watch from New Light campaign. For some reason, Bungie decided to give players one of the best primary weapons in the entire game in the New Light campaign, fresh out the gate. This thing comes with both Overflow for a 38 magazine and Explosive Payload, which is the best perk in the entire game for scout rifles. Anti-barrier scout rifle is going to be the mod we'll be pairing with this, and this is going to be your anti-barrier weapon instead of using something like Arbalest. Of course, there are going to be some people who probably don't have it because they either dismantled it or haven't reran the New Light campaign. You could use any ordinary scout rifle that there is in the game right now with explosive payload, and it will do the exact same thing. This just has a nicer quality of life effect. Then of course, over at the heavy slot, there are going to be still the option of using Red Herring. You could even trade this out for something like Threaded Needle. Both will get the exact same results depending on what your team runs. I personally like using Red Herring when I'm using Divinity because you could shoot it, lay lasting impression, spray the Divinity bubble, and you're getting the free damage from laying Divinity on an enemy. Then for the other weapons that I have in my inventory that we can talk about, I have a Witherhoard because you could still use Witherhoard here. It's a great weapon. Izanagi's Burden, if somebody else is using Divinity, gives you a really hard-hitting bullet towards a champion when they're sprayed with Divinity. Then we have a Escape Velocity or Last Breath with Osmosis. Both of these are able to overload champions and match our subclass type if we use Void. Then in the energy slot, I have Void Scout Rifles, each being earned from different parts of the game. The Vouchsafe, easily the best one out of the three, but one of the harder ones to obtain. It comes from the Dreaming City. The Royal Chase, which I don't think you can get anymore because the season of the hunt was removed, and so with all of its weapons, but it's still worth mentioning. And then the most budget option out there, which is Pointed Inquiry. You can craft this at level 1. It has Genesis, Adaptive Munitions, and it's Void. Then finally, of course, there's going to be a Truth Teller. Any kind of blinding grenade launcher you have will give you another way to CC ads and keep them off of you. At the same time, it's Void and procs volatile rounds. Over at the heavy slot, you have options like Lament for anti-barrier, Sleeper Simulant to pair with somebody's Divinity, and then other rocket launchers like Galahorn if you're doing rocket strats, or Tomorrow's Answer because it is also another Void rocket launcher. This is probably the most information I can give to you towards your loadout and make your life 1,000 times easier. Now that we got all of the weapons and everything figured out, let's talk about the builds themselves. Starting with build number 1, which I find to be the more fun of the two in this video, the Stasis Hunter. Now, the whole goal of this entire build is to freeze enemies constantly, gain a bunch of grenade energy every time we throw our grenade, and then flex any kind of exotic that we have based on preference. For the exotic that I like to run with it, it's Aeon Swift. You create heavy ammo every time you finish a champion or higher tier enemy, or any kind of special ammo if the enemy is lower than a champion. This is probably one of the key tools that everyone puts on a hunter going into a GM. and I found a lot of people expect this if you decide to LFG the Nightfall. Another thing that you could do is run the Assassin's Cowl. This will give you both a free overshield and invisibility every time you kill an enemy with a powered melee attack or a finisher. This is also a pretty solid alternative to Aeon Swift if you decide to run the Lucent Finisher mod, which creates heavy ammo every time you finisher either a Lucent Hivebearer, which aren't present in this Nightfall, or a champion. This mod also has great utility because it also creates heavy ammo for yourself, and if you pair it with Aeon Swift, you're creating 2 heavy bricks for your teammates instead of 1. Now, of course, other exotics could be mentioned here. These are just the ones that I personally prefer to bring. But moving on over to what makes your Stasis subclass, the aspects and fragments. As I mentioned before, we're going to be creating a lot of grenade energy, and that's exactly what we're going to do. For the grenade, we're going to be using Duskfield Grenade, and we're going to pair that with Touch of Winter. Touch of Winter is going to increase the size of our Duskfield Grenade and create a tiny crystal in the center, sucking enemies in and then freezing them. We're going to be using that as one of our main CC tools in the build, and to pair with it, we'll be using Grim Harvest so that defeating slowed or frozen enemies will create stasis shards. Stasis shards are stasis crystals that will just float in the air and provide us melee energy every time we pick them up. For the fragments, we're going to be using these to further enhance our grenade energy, volatile round weapons, and eventually create stacks of Charge with Light. Starting off over at the left with Whisper of Fissures, this is going to increase the damage and size of the burst of stasis every time we kill an enemy that's affected by it or our stasis crystals, giving us overall more AoE damage in the long run. Next, we're going to be using Whisper of Rending. This is going to increase kinetic damage to enemies that are either frozen or our own stasis crystals. This is going to give our volatile weapons even more damage when the enemy is frozen, meaning we're going to apply a freeze effect, deal more damage from the bullets themselves, and they're going to explode twice from both volatile and the freeze effect. For the next fragment, we're going to be using Whisper of Conduction so that all of the stasis shards we create from Grim Harvest are going to track to us when we're near them instead of having to go over them manually. This is a great quality of life fragment and probably the best one you can pair with Grim Harvest or any of the harvest aspects in general. Next, we're going to be using Whisper of Shards. That lone stasis crystal that we create from our Duskfield because of Touch of Winter is now going to refund us grenade energy back every time we destroy it, meaning in the long run more consistent grenade energy. Then for the final fragment, because we have a lot of slots from these aspects, it's going to be Whisper of Chain, so we take reduced damage when we are near anything frozen or our stasis crystal from the Duskfield Grenade. Any source of more damage resistance we can gain is better overall no matter what. Whisper of Chains is going to really help that final room the most because of how tightly packed it's going to be. If you guys do want to change up these fragments to what you guys like, that is an option, but if you do, I would change out Rending or even Whisper of Chains. Both of them are really optional. To keep up the momentum though, let's move on over to the armor and break down the mods that make the build. Starting off in the helmet, we're using Elemental Shards. This is going to cause our stasis shards from Glacial Harvest every 10 seconds to count as a stasis elemental well, thus creating a resource on top of a resource. For the other mods that we're using with it, because we have a stasis energy helmet, we're using Power Preservation so that our super will create extra orbs of power every time it creates orbs of power. You could also trade these out to use ammo finders if you find that Power Preservation isn't as valuable. But moving on over to the arms, we're going to be using the mod Reaping Wellmaker. Now we have to create Void Elemental Wells somehow in this build, and our dodge is one of the best tools out of all 3 classes to do so. What we do is use our class ability, aka our dodge, and then our next weapon kill is going to create a Void Elemental Well. That Void Well is then going to act as an extra resource so we can proc Volatile Flow or anything we want to use in the build using Elemental Wells. Speaking of Volatile Flow, moving on over to the chest piece, this is where we'll be using Volatile Flow. Picking up a Void Elemental Well is going to give your Void weapons volatile rounds, meaning they shoot void explosive bullets. Pretty self-explanatory, it is the main staple mod of Season 16. This is going to be one of the main ways we are dealing a lot of damage very quickly to a lot of the adds. But alongside the volatile flow and the chest piece, you're going to want yours to be void specifically for the void resistance mod. As we talked about earlier, acute burn is going to be void. So we want to take as little damage from void as possible, and void resistance is going to let us take 25% reduced damage. You could stack 2 here if you want to, but it will only stack it up to 40%, meaning you also lose out on thermoshock plating. Thermoshock plating is going to allow you to take 25% reduced damage from both arc and solar on top of void, letting you survive the Vandal wire rifles from the first half of the Nightfall. Moving on over to the boots, this is where we're going to be gaining those stacks of charge with light for our build, elemental charge. Picking up an elemental well will give you a stack of charge with light. Fairly simple. Picking up a elemental well that matches your subclass type will give you 2 instead of 1, meaning the elemental shards from earlier is going to make us gain 2 stacks of charge with light every 10 seconds when we pick up an elemental shard. Then to finish everything off over at the cloak, this is where we're going to be using our spender. Now you could use a lot of different things here depending on what you like. For the mod I enjoy using with this build, it's firepower. Throwing your grenade while charged with light is going to refund you 20% of your grenade at the cost of 1 stack of charge with light. This makes gaining grenade energy much more consistent alongside Whisper of Shards. If you don't like firepower, however, you could trade it out for multiple different things that you like in your build. For example, just throwing it out there, you could use high energy fire to gain 25% more damage until you get a kill consuming 1 stack of charge with light. Another solid option if you don't want more grenade energy. But next to it though, as I mentioned earlier, is Lucent Finisher, because in my build I'm using Aeon Swift to make more heavy ammo for my fire team. I'm going to use Lucent Finisher to double down on creating heavy ammo. Again, you could change this out for something different if you're using like Assassin's Cowl or anything else. This is just something I use for my build. Now for build number 2, which is relatively similar to build number 1, except we're going to be taking advantage of Void 3.0. Acute Void Burn, once again. Void 3.0 Hunter is by far the best subclass in the entire game for Hunter right now, but it is the most used at the same time. As I talked about in the intro, we're going to be able to make a bunch of orbs of power, volatile rounds left and right, invisibility everywhere, and heavy ammo / special ammo for our entire team. For the main exotic of this build, as I talked about earlier, yet again, it's going to be the Aeon Swift. When we finish our champion enemies, it creates heavy ammo. Bosses, it creates heavy ammo. Anything below that, it creates special ammo. We're going to be able to go invisible on demand or on kill against enemies. So walking up, finishing enemies, going invisible, it just adds up over time and speeds up your overall run. But starting off with the aspects and fragments, we're going to be using Vanishing Step so that when we use our dodge ability, it's going to make us invisible on demand. And then we're going to pair that with Stylish Executioner so that any enemy that is affected by a weakened, suppressed, or volatile effect is going to give us invisibility and True Sight on kill. This is pretty much going to be the bread and butter for the entire build. We get a kill with our volatile rounds, we go invisible. We press our dodge ability, we go invisible. What more could you ask for out of this? You could also mess around with the other aspect, Trapper's Ambush, if you want to play around with something like Omnioculus and Smoke Bombs to make everybody invisible. But this is what I found to be one of the more fun versions of Void 3.0 Hunter. For the fragments, we're going to be using Echo of Expulsion. Enemies explode from our Void abilities. Echo of Persistence. Our Void buffs that we create, Invisibility, Overshield, and Devour, have increased duration. The main reason we're using this is, of course, for invisibility. Longer invisibility means more survivability in the long run. For the next fragment, this is where it's going to change up a little bit. We're using Echo of Obscurity. Finish your final blows, grant invisibility. Now, if you're not using Assassin's Cowl, and you decide to use Aeon Swift like I am, Echo of Obscurity can be quite potent when going in to finish your champions. If there's a huge amount of mobs and you finisher that champion, it's gonna be pretty tricky getting out without your dodge or any enemies to kill with volatile rounds. This will just add an extra layer of defense so you get out safely. And then for the final fragment of this build, it's gonna be Echo of Instability. Defeating targets with your grenades create volatile rounds for your void weapons. Yet again, another way to create volatile rounds and have a much more consistent build. If you do want to swap any of these out, you could mess around with something like Undermining for weaken effects on your grenades, or Echo of Provisions to gain smoke bomb energy every time you damage enemies with your grenade. Keeping up with the last build, we're also going to move right over into the armor and break down the mods, and these are going to be relatively similar to the very first build. Starting off with the helmet, we're going to be using Font of Might because we are using a Void subclass with Void weapons. This is an alternative to high energy fire and gives us 25% damage whenever we pick up a Void elemental well. What more could you ask for? But then this is where it gets interesting because alongside it, we're using 2 power preservations. This is going to give us more orbs of power whenever we kill enemies with our super. Meaning when we kill enemies with our tether, we get 2 shots in our Mobius quiver, we create a bunch of orbs to basically feed our allies orbs for them to get supers, and then for them to use their supers to give us our super back to repeat this cycle. Moving over to the arms, it's the exact same thing as build 1. We're using Reaping Wellmaker to gain a Void Well on kill after we use our class ability. Again, easily one of the best resource creating mods in the entire season. Next up over at the chest piece, this is where we're going to be using Volatile Flow with our Void Resistance mod and a Thermoshock plating, very similar to the first build. Over at the boots, this is where it changes up a little because we're using Well of Tenacity. Picking up a Void Elemental Well from any source that we have to create wells will give us 50% damage resistance from all sources for 5 seconds. Extremely useful and can save you in some of the worst scenarios you can get yourself into. And finally, finishing everything off over at the class item, we're using Elemental Ordnance so that when we get kills with our Void Grenade, it creates a Void Elemental Well. Another way to create an Elemental Well to proc Volatile Flow and Well of Tenacity. Then we're going to be using Overload Grenades so that our Void Grenades will also overload champions. Very useful against those overload champions in the final room. And then I'm also using Loosen Finisher as an option. You guys could change it up to whatever you like also. Overall though guys, those are both of the builds for our hunter for the Glassway Nightfall, meaning we finished all 3 GM Nightfall builds for the Glassway GM. This is probably the most information packed video I've ever made, and if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments, and I wish you all best of luck on your Glassway Nightfall. I'll be catching you guys next week for Ala Cool the Lightblade. Bye bye.